The most unsettling aspect of studying true crime is you learn that we just have no idea what kind of dark depravity might be lurking inside someone's head. The twisted stuff of nightmares for most might be the obsessive focus of fantasy for others. And though you might comfort yourself that this is the world of troubled loners and outcast losers, you'd be wrong to take too much comfort in that. In this twisted story, we'll encounter a man who was not only a successful entrepreneur, but a kind of celebrity in his country. A man who had a devoted group of followers. This was a man who gave TED Talks on YouTube. A man oozing with charisma. A brilliant inventor whose one known murder, a horrific tale we're about to tell, was so poorly carried out that you might think the whole thing was done on a whim. You might think that his sadistic urges simply overpowered him and he was unable to stop himself. But this was no whim. He had carefully planned this escapade into horror. He took with him the tools of his sadism, tapered screwdrivers, bondage straps, and a wood saw. These were used to torture his victim. And because they were alone inside his homemade submarine, he could take all the time he wanted to do it. A troubling question lingers, since he almost certainly filmed it, and he was arrested after being rescued from the water. What happened to the film? Motive, you ask? Didn't know the woman, just met her. She was an independent journalist working on a story about his own fascinating projects. He built subs, and his next plan was to build a space rocket to carry passengers. No, he had no motive other than to satisfy his depraved fantasies involving the torture and death of an innocent woman. Fantasies fueled by a collection of snuff films where real people are tortured and killed. I want to pause for a quick second to discuss why I investigate true crime, and maybe why you're interested in it. Because to be frank, after researching this case, I had trouble sleeping last night, to the point where I'm not sure I want to continue this type of work. And I'm not a squeamish person. We go through life rather comfortable that we have it all mostly figured out. We think we have a good sense of how the world works, how people think, and how they behave. Of course, we know there are serial killers and human monsters out there, but we tend to lock these into a cabinet with Bigfoot and aliens, even if we don't believe in those particular things. We see these killers as so distant from our world that they almost feel mythical. But just how distant are they really? You may never have run into a serial killer. Of course, if you did, you almost certainly wouldn't know it. However, the most unsettling part of studying true crime is not even the existence of half-crazed fiends who kill again and again over many years. No, the most unsettling part is actually how many people that seem to be out there that have dark obsessions brewing inside their heads. People who seem quite normal on the outside. It could be your neighbor, your boss, a family member, or even your doctor. They might smile and treat you kindly. But what's really going on behind that smile? I don't say this to make you suspicious of the everyday people you encounter. Most of them are good, decent people. But more of them are struggling with a monster inside than we care to know. At the end of this video, I'm going to directly address those of you who might have such a monster lurking within. I feel the need to do this because a great worry in discussing these crimes is that it feeds the fantasies of those who dream of similar things. In the off chance that my words reach the ears of someone like that, I want them to understand that nature has made them what they are. And they can play the part of the hero instead of the villain, if they choose. Now let's get to the villain of this terrible crime. Peter Madsen, born in 1971 in Denmark, seems to have grown up in a somewhat troubled family situation, as we often see in killers of this type. His father had more than 30 years on his mother, who had 3 boys from previous boyfriends. His father was abusive towards his stepsons. When Peter was 6, his parents split up. After a couple of years, he chose to go live with his father, with whom he shared an interest in rockets. Peter displayed rare intelligence, and by the time he turned 15, he was already building his own rockets. He tinkered and experimented and had access to engineers to guide his development during upper secondary school, which I think is the equivalent of high school in the US. When he was 18, his father died. The first hint at something wrong is a very odd reference in Wikipedia. It says around this time he joined the Dansk Amateur Rocket Club, or DARK, but the other members gradually became disillusioned with him. Here's where the description is really weird. It says other members claimed saying his name out loud would start the fire sprinkler system. No further description is available on that. I doubt rocket engineers are prone to believing in the supernatural, so this is probably a way of saying Madsen was a divisive figure. When we look back at the development of a sadistic killer, the key time period to focus on is early adolescence. Madsen would ultimately become a sexual sadist. It's usually the combination of two things that lead to these types of people becoming killers. First, the person begins to become consumed by fantasies involving torture. Second, the individual's brain is a little bit different than normal in that he is not capable of much empathy. So there's nothing to limit the scope of his fantasies. He's not capable of putting himself in someone else's shoes, so he has no feeling about their suffering. Doesn't have what most would consider a conscience, so he doesn't experience remorse. He doesn't feel guilty about having inappropriate fantasies, so they keep growing. He begins to have them even about people he knows. And this apparently did happen with Madsen, who had such fantasies about his colleagues. How did he first become absorbed in fantasies of torture? We don't know, but usually it seems to begin with exposure to images and video that display this stuff. Why was his brain incapable of empathy? MRIs on psychopaths show that the region of the brain responsible for empathy is not properly developed. They're usually born this way. If they grow up in a loving, stable environment, they're much less likely to develop into killers. They still are capable of only very limited empathy for others, but what little capacity they have is given the best chance to develop. And they have a healthier self-image which steers them in the direction of remaining within the bounds of acceptable behavior. As an adult, Madsen eventually began hanging around S&M clubs, so his fantasy life grew out of control. As I mentioned at the end of the video, I'm going to directly address these types of people in the off chance one is watching. And given how many of these people there seem to be, they are out there consuming this stuff. So Madsen never finished any formal education, but people were drawn to his talent and to his infectious energy around his projects. He obviously had charisma because he had no problem winning financial support. In 2011, at the age of 40, the by now famous entrepreneur got married. The marriage lasted 7 years. While his passion remained working with rockets, and he had the dream of building a vehicle capable of reaching space, his main work involved building submarines, private submarines. Most prominent of these was the Nautilus. That's where Kim Wall would meet her gruesome fate. Kim Wall, a beautiful, award-winning journalist, was born in Sweden in 1987. She attended the prestigious London School of Economics and graduated with a degree in international relations. But after graduating, she felt called to a career in journalism, a natural fit given both her parents were journalists. She then went to Columbia University in the US to get her master's in journalism. After doing an internship in China, she took up the study of Mandarin. She fell in love with the country and planned to settle there. So this was a very intelligent young woman. She was a good person who worked hard to put a spotlight on suffering and injustice around the globe. After obtaining her master's, she became an independent journalist, publishing articles for the New York Times, Time Magazine, The Guardian, The Atlantic. In 2017, she made the fateful decision to reach out to Peter Madsen for an interview. It was an easy project for her since she lived right near Copenhagen where his base was. She was in the midst of planning to move to Beijing with her boyfriend when Madsen replied. He said he was available for an interview that afternoon. And after they met, he invited her on a little trip around the bay in his submarine that evening. Kim's boyfriend dropped her off at the submarine at 7 p.m. with a promise to return for her in 2 hours when they got back. She had a video camera with her. That camera was never found. Madsen had contacted 4 other female reporters during that week, all of whom declined his offer of a little underwater trip. Those 4 women narrowly avoided entering a nightmare beyond imagination. Madsen had packed a large wood saw, a knife, tapered screwdrivers, and bondage straps. And he spent the time before Kim's arrival working himself up by watching videos about decapitation and asphyxiation sex. Here's a photo of Kim on top of the sub right before the journey to hell began. Here's another taken from a passing boat. Moments before she was about to be subjected to suffering and horror that is too difficult to imagine. It's the last image of Kim. Well, depending on what Madsen did with the camera. When Kim's boyfriend returned 2 hours later to pick her up, there was no sign of the sub. He waited patiently, getting more anxious as minutes turned into hours. By 1 a.m., now starting to panic, he finally called police. They reacted swiftly and began a wide search. But for hour after hour, they found nothing. How much of that time was Kim being tortured below the water inside the cramped space of a submarine? There's a hint at what Peter had in mind, therefore how it went down. Days before he killed Val, he texted a female friend telling her he was planning a murder on his submarine. Apparently, he wanted his friend to go with him, where they would bring another woman, and then they would suddenly change the mood, he said, and begin cutting her up. So that gives an idea how it probably went down. Kim's last text to her boyfriend was sent as the sub was moving out into the harbor on the surface. Her message said, "I'm still alive, by the way. I'm going down now. I love you." He brought coffee and cookies. So when they reached a certain point in the bay, Madsen, being warm and friendly, the gracious host, brought her below, sealed the hatch. And at some point, he turned on a dime. Based on his message to the other friend, this was probably a part he dreamed about in his fantasies. That moment when he turned his victim's smile to sudden terror. She was trapped there. No way out. Screaming was completely pointless. He overpowered her, bound her, and began her ordeal. Thinking of how many hours this went on made me unable to sleep last night. Madsen spoke to a reporter at length from prison. He described Kim's death. He was in the midst of telling his victim something when at some point she left the world. These are his words. It was the operation of the situation. It may have been shock, but she became distant and she disappeared. I'm not a doctor, but this suggests to me that Madsen had subjected her to lengthy torture, which resulted in significant loss of blood loss which occurred not quickly though, but over time. Kim Val was a person who had spent her adult life campaigning for the impoverished around the world. She was a good person who had witnessed her share of evil, but in third world countries and war-torn regions. In her last terrible hours, it must have been a shock for Kim to learn that monsters don't only emerge from circumstances of strife and despair. They lurk all around us, even within our citadels of privilege. Finally, around 11 a.m., 27 hours after leaving, the sub resurfaced. But it was sinking as it did. Madsen radioed for help. When rescuers arrived, he was strangely relaxed about the fact that he no longer had Kim with him. Cops weren't having any of it, however, and they arrested him. He was charged at that point with negligent homicide. At this point, the police only knew something terrible had happened. Madsen's first explanation was that he had dropped Kim off at a waterfront restaurant, but police checked surveillance footage in that area and found no evidence of that. Now Madsen's story changed. He claimed that the door hatch of the sub had accidentally hit her on the head, and he had to bury her at sea. 10 days later, he was forced to change his story again when a naked torso washed up on the shore. No head and no limbs. Now he claimed that she had been overcome by carbon monoxide while he was on the surface of the sub. Wanting to dispose of the body at sea, he said he was forced to dismember it in order to get it through the hatch. Divers found plastic bags in the bay containing Kim's limbs, clothing, the saw, and the knife, and eventually her head, which showed no sign of having been struck on top. Kim's torso had been stabbed 15 times. She had bind markings on her limbs. She had been stabbed and mutilated in her genitals. Madsen was convicted of murder in 2018 and sentenced to life. But in Denmark, a life sentence usually results in release after 16 years. As I've said in many videos, unfortunately, the people who run many of the legal institutions in Europe and America were born to privilege. So their understanding of the actual world is shallow. They have a very limited experience of it. Their ideology, instilled at an early age by academics who likewise have little experience of the actual world, prevents them from seeing reality. So they don't understand monsters because they don't believe in them. There is the lingering question of what happened to Kim's video camera. And this was 2017. Madsen was a very technological guy, and he was obsessed with snuff films. He was plugged into the underground S&M community. It seems impossible that he didn't bring his own cameras. It seems impossible that he wouldn't want to film this. Yet when he sank his sub and was in the water before being rescued, then arrested, he was not in possession of any recorded material. None was found on his sub when it was brought to the surface. So again, what happened to Kim's camera? He could have tossed it like the body parts. Maybe it just wasn't found. But were there other ways to get this footage out? Two ideas come to mind for me. Maybe you can think of more. One, he could have surfaced and transmitted the footage via satellite or cell tower to a secret account, then just thrown the equipment overboard and hasn't been found. Or two, an accomplice met him at sea. In fact, this possibility, which I have not seen suggested anywhere else, troubles me. There were two possible hints that this could have happened. First, Madsen's message to the woman we discussed suggests he was looking for an accomplice for his torture session. Second, listen to this admission of guilt by Madsen in the same interview from prison. Madsen had been very slow to admit guilt. He blamed Kim Wall herself, suggesting she triggered him. But finally he says this: there is nothing about whose fault it is. It's my fault she died, and it's my fault because I committed the crime. It's all my fault. There are different ways to interpret this. He could be trying to speak to a future parole board where admission of guilt might be seen as an essential indication of rehabilitation. But I can't help also wondering if this sudden emphasis on he says my fault 3 times, is a bit of an overemphasis, as though he wants to insist there's no one else involved. Since no one seems to be suggesting that, why insist on it? It's a disturbing thought because it means there could be an accomplice to this murder, someone still on the loose, and that accomplice would have the footage of what happened on that sub. One more disturbing thought to add to this. Madsen, though a self-taught engineer, strangely seemed to have many wealthy benefactors, people who sponsored his work. Did he meet any of them at these S&M clubs? Was there a link between their funding of his projects and a possible mutual interest in the S&M world? There were more twists to follow in this case. Within months of his imprisonment, Madsen had seduced a female guard. It's important to remember how brilliantly manipulative psychopaths can be. They know how to win people over. In 2020, Madsen managed to escape prison. Details of how he did this are not available, but as I said, these creatures are not only highly intelligent, they're experts at manipulation. He was caught and sent back to prison. 21 months were tacked onto his life sentence, so I suppose he'll now serve 17 years instead of 16. When you look at this case and many others like it, it's hard to rectify how the predator could be so brilliant, so clever, and yet so reckless. Did Madsen really believe there would not be a rigorous search for Kim Wall? And this man who built subs and rockets couldn't figure out how to dispose a corpse without it washing ashore within days? Did he think police wouldn't salvage his sub so it could be inspected? That they would believe his story after they found blood inside? Could he not foresee that divers would search for her remains? He was a man who built 3 subs, so he knew his way around the water. He must have had an idea what divers could do. It's baffling. The only thing I can conclude from it is that some of the brilliance of these predators is weakened when they're in the grips of such overpowering sexual fantasy. They no longer think clearly. Here's a man who had so much going for him, yet was willing to risk it all to attempt a wild fantasy that had virtually no chance of working. At that point, the fantasies have become so compulsive that the predator can almost no longer resist them. This is where I must stop and look at those of you that have such fantasies. I want to address you personally. I feel compelled to do this because I don't want to add more fuel to your fantasies. If you're consumed by these types of thoughts, I want to appeal not to your conscience, but to your ego, because we both know you have a large one. You are a different breed. You know this. You're proud of it. You're not burdened by things like remorse. You're highly intelligent, clever. You feel little fear. Danger excites you. You feel superior to ordinary men. And in ways you are. There was a time thousands of years ago when men like you could be an asset to their clan because you don't feel fear, because you're bold and you're smarter and you aren't handicapped by conscience. There was an evolutionary purpose for men like you to appear within the tribe. You were important to its survival. But in that long ago age, there were no videos or magazines to fuel fantasy life. So you never would have become obsessed by the dreams now playing in your mind. You might have become a war leader, a chieftain, or even a king. But now you're consumed by fantasies, and your community no longer needs warlords. So I'm appealing to your ego. Don't let the fantasies win. Get it under control. Seek help if necessary. Peter Madsen could now be on his way to building vehicles for space travel, a kind of Danish Elon Musk, but instead he's inside a cell. You two were born a different breed apart from ordinary humans. Be the hero you are capable of being, not the monster these fantasies will turn you into.